when people didn't just say we want to be Christians, they also said we want to be like the Byzantines, who of course didn't know they were the Byzantines, they just thought they were the Romans. And everybody wanted to be like the Roman Empire. So when we were in Denmark, we traveled outside the city to the cathedral where all the kings and queens of Denmark are buried. And it's consciously modeled after the church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, where all the Byzantine emperors were buried. So they said, well, this is how you do it. And this is, you have some saints' relics in the center. And it's the same with the Cathedral of Saint-Denis in northern Paris. It's modeled too after the Byzantine way of doing things. So the influence of that, what was the highest civilization, spread throughout the world, or throughout Europe. So anyway, so as I said, even before 860, this attack, somehow people were getting Christianized, there was trade, there was contact, people were inspired, they liked the faith, and this is phase one. I think the Swedish influence in this period, earliest period, is kind of ambivalent in that some of the Swedes wanted to Christianize themselves and Russia and even their own country, and others were fiercely devoted to the pagan cult and even killed and murdered those who became Christian. Nevertheless, the Swedes give the avenue for the influence, for the communication. This brings us to the second phase, which we really already discussed, and that's that now St. Olga and St. Vladimir say, no, definitely we're going to do it. As we said, it's Rurik. Rurik's daughter-in-law is Olga, his great-grandson is Vladimir. That's how direct the thing is. And it's the immediate descendants of the Viking rulers of themselves, still Vikings, who unify and Christianize this Kievan kingdom, what is today Ukraine. And in Sweden today, among Orthodox, the belief is that we Swedes were the godparents of Orthodoxy in Russia. There were churches there, who knows, maybe for 2 centuries before. I want to finish this part of the thing with the story I was in, after I spent these 2-3 weeks in Sweden and Norway, and what a blessing that was, and I'm so grateful to the people who brought me there, and just sort of assimilating all this. And I went to Moscow just for 5 days to see my spiritual father, and one day I was in the metro in Moscow, and the guy got on the train, and it was so funny, he has a very classic, not a classic Russian look, but certain men in Russia look exactly like him, I think, a certain face. And that face looks exactly like Bono. And I was like, oh my God, the Vikings founded Dublin, they're in Russia. It's all just one, thing, how history is with us. So that kind of ends the second phase, and we're going to go to the third phase, and this is where things get trickier. And I should finish by 8, right, Father? But we're going to go to the pictures too, and that'll be more fun. So how things happen, we raise our children, and then they someday rival us, or we help someone, and then they could become powerful enough to compete with us. Constantinople was really the mother of Venice, but it was Venice that destroyed Constantinople in 1204. It was really the city the Venetians did it. And Russia eventually becomes a direct and powerful rival to her Swedish godmother. But although Russia outdevelops Sweden in every way, I think of the famous duel in Romeo and Juliet, there's sort of nothing outwardly is happening, but one is wounded, and Russia in a way is wounded by its further competition with the Swedes, and I'll say how. First, back to 988. So after 988, Vladimir is Orthodox, and the empire, the Kievan principalities are unified, and things prosper, and people accept the Christian faith, and the laws are promulgated, and all these civilizational things happen. Churches are built. They build 2 copies of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, one in Novgorod, one in Kiev. Some people say Olga did, some people say Anna of Novgorod did. I think it was Anna, just because I feel like thinking that. No reason.
What was the first city again?
Kiev and Novgorod.
Novgorod, where's that?
It should be...
It's in Ukraine.
I think it might be in Belarus, today's Belarus, it might be further north, or in northern Ukraine. So, and that's interesting too, because in the year 1000, the Hagia Sophia they're copying is already almost 500 years old. Right? It's amazing, you know, the depth of, you know, Orthodox history. So, for the next 350 years, things are more or less going along. But then, like all other Orthodox lands, they eventually get attacked by the Mongols. And the Mongols come and they come into Europe, so-called Golden Horde. But in particular, for 150 years, they conquer the Russian-speaking lands. And they smash the great cities of Russia. And Russia passes into a dark age. And what emerges out of that are principalities that have to pay tribute to Mongol Muslims. And the most important principality that emerges is in Moscow. And this is where the center of gravity of the Russian nation switches, let's say for the first time, from Kiev to Moscow. So Kiev never really recovers its power. And in fact, it increasingly becomes subject to Lithuanian and Polish kingdoms from the West, who forcibly make the people switch from Orthodoxy to Catholicism. So now we're after the schism. And this is the origin of the problems in the Ukraine today. Because for the Ukrainians in the western part of the country that were more subject to this Lithuanian, even German, but mostly Polish and Lithuanian influence and became Roman Catholic, they identify with Europe and with Germany and the European Union. And in the eastern half of the Ukraine, the people who remain Russian Orthodox, they identify with Russia. So this is really what's being fought about now, because the Ukraine got its independence when the Soviet Union collapsed and has tried to join the EU and even NATO. But some people don't want that, some people do. So it's this fault line, much like within Bosnia being Roman Catholic and Serbia being Orthodox. Although that they speak the same language and everything, and the culture is so similar, just because of the different faith, there's a different cultural identity, and then there's conflict. So this really came about because the Golden Horde smashed the Ukrainian state, and as I said, that's in the year 1237, 1240. There's no one there to help them, and 150 years later, everything looks different. Now a new northern Russia arises, centered on Moscow. The heart of Russia today is really the St. Sergius Holy Trinity Lavra, north of Moscow, St. Sergius of Radonezh, the great national saint. It's for the church there, incidentally, the Holy Trinity Church, that Andrei Rublev painted his famous Holy Trinity icon. And this is the heart of Russia. And St. Sergius is still living when Prince Dmitry of Moscow raises an army to drive off the Mongols. And Sergius blesses them, blesses the assembled army, and prophesies their victory. And then draws all his monks into prayer and prays throughout the entire battle, but he's 50 miles away. But as each Christian soldier dies, he sees it noetically and he says the person's name, St. Sergius of Radonezh. If you ever go to Russia, that's the one thing you have to see almost. I mean, there's nothing quite like the Holy Trinity Lavra. This victory does not produce total peace for Russia. It's about 1480 before Mongol holds finally. And what do they find when 1480 comes? Well, the Sweden of 1480 is now, of course, fully Christian and was Christianized in these three ways. First, through their guards, the Varangian guards then, and then about the year 1000 in Husaby, and then finally by German missionaries. Well, this Sweden is now almost like a nation state with a monarchy, and it's not just a loose confederation of warrior traders, and it's much stronger. There's a huge Lithuanian kingdom ruling the western half of the Ukraine and forcing the people into Catholicism. And it stretches northward nearly to the Baltic Sea. Behind it is a much smaller Polish kingdom. There's orders of Teutonic Knights that have what is like Estonia in that area. The Ottoman Empire, by 1480, has taken Constantinople. They've got everything. They've got all of North Africa, all of the Middle East, all of Saudi Arabia. They've got all of Anatolia, of course, and Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, and Serbia, and Greece, as I said. The Ottomans are the only true superpower on the planet in 1500. And then there's two giant and powerful Muslim Khanates to the south that block Russia from the Black Sea. So Russia is more of a northern power, and what is in the Ukraine are Khanates or Lithuanians. They can't really get out there. So Russia sets out to kind of recover its strength, and 200 years later, now we're getting towards the end of the 1600s, they've made very little progress. They're still kind of in a small state up there. And Sweden, meantime, has gotten much stronger. Now they control everything on the east of the Baltic, including Finland, including Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, parts of Poland, and they also have all of what Russia's bordering on the Baltic. So Sweden is very strong. And now comes the period of history that kind of almost leads to the disaster of the Russian Orthodox Church. Two amazing military leaders arise. In Stockholm, it's Charles XII of Sweden, and in Russia, it's Peter the Great, who first is in Moscow there. He's the Tsar of Moscow. And they go at it in the late 1600s, early 1700s. In 1700, everyone arises and tries to attack the Swedes. They're so powerful. Denmark, Norway attacks them. Saxony, Lithuania, Poland attack them, and Russia. They coordinated. It's an alliance. Charles XII is only 18 years old. He has no experience in ruling or fighting, and he pretty much beats them all. He's really great. Within 6 years, he's utterly subdued the Norwegians and the Danes, and even conquered much of parts of Norway. Eventually, Norway will fall under Sweden, and he's also beaten the Lithuanian Poles. And then he invades Russia. And he takes 24,000 men, and he goes all the way to Moscow, where he's heading there. And Peter is desperately trying to organize for this match. He's been preparing his whole life for this. Peter went to, you may know the story, Peter went to Amsterdam and Holland, and in disguise, he was part of a Russian embassy, but he pretended to be a clerk. He was 6'6", you couldn't miss him, but he refused to answer to Peter or the Tsar or whatever. And he worked for 6 months in a Dutch shipyard. So in the 1600s, the Dutch have already got, I guess, New York and, I don't know, Indonesia, and they're this major world power. And he can see that Europe is the future, and if Russia can't get in contact with them, they're finished. So he learns everything he can, but he's not really a big fan of the church. He thinks that the church is holding them back. In any case, he's able to beat Charles XII in Poltava. That's the battle on the way to Moscow. And Charles XII takes 500 of his men, and he was always very tricky, and instead of heading towards his own homeland, he just goes south. So Peter doesn't expect that, and he escapes. He goes straight to the Turks. And the Turks are allied with these Khanates, and Peter manages to convince the Sultan to give him an army of 200,000 men. So he had 24,000 on his own, but now he's got 200,000 under the Turks to invade Russia again. It's amazing. And Peter realizes it's hopeless, and he sends emissaries, and they somehow manage to bribe the prime minister of the Sultan, the Grand Vizier, so that the war is called off. Otherwise, Russia's finished. And then even in the midst of the war, Peter founds the city of St. Petersburg, which you see up here on the map. And he says, no matter what it takes, and St. Petersburg is far north even of Russia, of Moscow, although maps don't show that. St. Petersburg has the midnight sun and all that. Moscow really doesn't. in June. It has the midnight sun and all that. So he founds this new city, and he moves the capital. In the middle of the war, he moves the capital. He's not backing down. He's got to open Russia to the west. So what is the wound that the Russian Orthodox Church suffers in the midst of all this? Well, it's just this, that for the Swedes, coming out of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, they decided the way to overcome religious violence and all the rest is just say that, like was decided in the rest of Europe, whatever is the religion of the ruler, the people have to follow that. And moreover, the church becomes, especially the Protestant churches, becomes a department of the state. So the Lutheran Church or the Post-Reformation Church in Sweden is a department of the Swedish state. And Peter decides this is the model, so that he can overcome any cultural resistance of conservatives in the Russian Orthodox Church. And when the Patriarch dies in the year 1700, the Patriarch of Moscow, Peter does not replace him. He just leaves the chair empty. So for 200 years, there's no Patriarch in Moscow. Instead, a minister appointed by the Tsar, whoever happens to be the Tsar or the Tsarina, because Catherine, of course, comes after him. I don't know how much after, but eventually. They govern the church. And there's a synod of bishops. And the Metropolitan of Moscow, who's no longer a Patriarch but a Metropolitan, has a certain, primacy, but not much. And Peter inflicts a second wound on the church, which is that he decides that the church has too much power because it has so much land. So he begins closing monasteries, as many monasteries as he can, and stripping as much property as he can from the Orthodox Church. And this fatally wounds the main work that was funded by all those monasteries, which is care for the poor. So both these things, are almost fatal for Christianity or Orthodoxy in Russia. Because 200 years later, the plight of the poor has reached crisis proportions. The church is hamstrung. Its monastic cadre is shrunk. Its wealth to do anything is shrunk. The government hasn't replaced it with its own welfare state or something like that that would keep things going. And that's really what brings about, or at least provides a lot of the grist, the fuel for the October Revolution of 1917. Other things happen, but principally that. It's significant that the moment the last Tsar abdicates, in 1917 or 18, whatever it is, the first thing that the church does is hold a council, the Church of Russia, and reinstate the Patriarchate. The first thing they do is to move to fill the gap of charitable work, fill the gap of help for the poor, but it's too late. So this is a case where the Swedish influence and example, as I said, nearly proved fatal for the plight of Orthodoxy in Russia. In conclusion, because it's just after 8, I think we can just leave with a great sense of compassion, really, for everyone, because they face so many existential struggles of attempts to wipe out their national identity, their language, their faith, their borders. They struggled for so many centuries. All the European peoples did, and they came through that struggle. And certainly Peter didn't know what a whirlwind he was sowing with his decisions. He was trying himself to do what he could. When you go to St. Petersburg today, I mean, it's so clearly a sister city of Copenhagen, Helsinki, Stockholm. I mean, they're so clearly, I haven't been to northern Poland, but built at the same time, with the same outlook. He brought them into the world of European civilization again. There's other things we can say about that, but maybe we should just go to the pictures of the protests a little bit here. So here what we have is that the there was a prime minister in the Ukraine who signed these agreements with the European community, the EC, or the European Union, as it's sometimes called, for Ukraine to join. She was involved in personal corruption, and for other reasons she lost an election, and her successor immediately allied himself with Moscow and tried to bring the entirety of the Ukraine more deeply into that orbit. So we're going to abrogate the agreements with the European Union, and we're going to sign agreements with the Russians and their customs unions and trade unions and things. This has set off the protests, and I'm not up to the minute on it, but the protests became violent on both sides. You see pictures on both sides. It looks like a war zone. The protesters are shooting with live bullets, and so are the police. So these priests, some of them from local monasteries, some of them married priests, have come into the midst of that and said, well, we will just stand here so that at least no one is killed. They cannot resolve the political issues because they're deep, and I have no idea what the resolution should be. I can't begin to know what's happening there. But again and again, every day these priests are going, and they're trying to make that statement of peace. And from the Christian way, to try to neutralize the violence in the world, if necessary, at the cost of your own life. Blessed are the peacemakers, Christ said, for they shall be called sons of God. And what happened to the Son of God? He was crucified. So that's the witness that they have given to the world here. A few years ago, there was a similar picture from an anti-globalization or something protest in Greece that showed a young man with a Molotov cocktail and a mask, and a monk trying to block him. I don't know if you remember that beautiful picture. I have that on my desktop. And we're so encouraged to see our faith, being lived out that way. What will happen in the end, we don't know. Under the Soviet Union, incidentally, they tried to suppress the so-called Byzantine Catholics in the Ukraine, try to force them back, or just, I don't even know what the motivation was. And of course, since the independence, the Roman Catholic Church has poured lots of resources in there so everyone trying to get their own church going, and this is a sad situation where what was the cradle of, in our minds, Russian Orthodoxy has become divided in this way. Are there any questions about anything? Because I know we went a little late, but not really. It's 8:05. Are there any questions about?
These pictures are today.